Welcome to Amped Radio. We have Donnie Gebert on the line. He wrote the book Direct Republic: The Null Hypothesis of Politics. Just came out. He's a 19-year military veteran, and he has a lot to say, a lot of good stuff to say, a lot of challenging, introspective things to say. And this is really what we need to be talking about these days. Really taking a look at what we have and what we can do about it. And his book has really enlightened me and helped me understand a lot, and also kind of think about what we can do in this age of technology. So, Donnie, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Max.
I really just want to start from the beginning, and we've had a conversation before the show started, and just kind of go from there wherever the conversation takes us. So I want to start with when did you start looking into this stuff and start beginning your intellectual journey to ultimately writing this book?
I was pretty much a educated constitutionalist up to, well, if there is such a thing, up to about 2008. Ron Paul 2008 was, I had already seen that several, like I would be telling my family, look, there's two kinds of Republicans. They're the ones who know what they talk about, and there's the other ones, okay? So we were in 2008, my normal family, as we were, understanding politics, were not only is the Democratic Party not functional, and it's not personal. Like I don't hate on Democrats or anything. Like all of this is dumb. There's no ideological component here. My family wasn't Democrats because there's a lot of things in the Democratic Party that don't actually function, and it looks like what's going on with the Clintons. Let's just say my family, my parents were the only Republicans in a whole family of Democrats 25, 30 years ago. Now there's no Democrats left. So that's the normal transition of suburbia America. Like I'm from, fairly broke Pennsylvania suburbs. So I was born off the paved road, but I had electricity and shit. So normal, what I consider just normal people growing up in the wild, nobody knows what's going on. By 2008, my family was starting to convert from Democrat to Republican, and I kept telling my parents, you don't understand. That guy obviously doesn't know what he's talking about because of this. Because I have been there, and this guy is an idiot. Like Marco Rubio, almost never brings up anything germane. Ted Cruz talks about some germane things. Like you can almost tell who the dumbasses are and who the really corrupt ones are just by what they focus on in politics. So 2008, I was constitutionalist in the military, fundamentally a Rothbardian, even though I didn't know who Rothbard was, because I know the system was stupid, but I knew that there was also a problem, and I didn't understand the definition of help because the problem was bigger than me. So I'm just part of the machine that's supposed to fix the problem. And also, until Bitcoin, I want to say Bitcoin was late 2008, early 2009. Until Bitcoin, every single human didn't have any options. Because I don't know how to fix any of this prior to 2008. So even then, everybody on Earth, you just kind of have to take a moment and say, everybody on Earth in 2008 gets a pass. Now, there was, there's the murderers and the rapists and the Clintons and all this stuff that's coming out of there. Okay, we're not talking about forgiveness for the bullshit. I mean, anybody who had a political leaning as of 2008, okay, like nobody really knew how to do it. But after that, you could start figuring out macro systems because you could do a transoceanic payment system without fraud. Like Bitcoin fundamentally solved the problem of a transoceanic fraud that could lead to war. After that, we're good. After that, we're good, because now the reasons you might want to go to war start becoming insurable events of smaller and smaller natures, where somebody wouldn't want to deal with a larger problem. To give you an example, when the American military tells Lloyd's of London, yeah, anybody fucks with the oil fields in Kuwait and we're going to war, then Lloyd's of London is more than happy to write a large insurance policy for many oil fields in Kuwait, because they know that there will be M1 tanks and 500,000 Americans there to get it back. And when a professional goes to do it, he does it in a week. His name was Norman Schwarzkopf, and then he picked his shit up and went home like a big boy. The end. It was done. It was over, right? So that's how you have to secure private property rights in 1991. And there's a lot of people who say, but it was all chicanery. And I understand. I understand there was chicanery, but you really have to fundamentally understand the 80s. Like, man, I'm coming through the 80s, and I don't even bother trying to do any kind of forensic understanding of of the terms and conditions a political leader or a military leader would be making back then, because they didn't even have good data sets. So now you're looking at generals making incomplete data sets. To give you an example, Dwight Eisenhower had much better data sets than Westmoreland.
When was Warland?
Westmoreland was Vietnam. So Ike fundamentally understood the planet as mostly people without electricity, running water. There was no civilization any fucking where on the planet. And then he had to deal with armies in certain places based around civilization. So he fundamentally understood the entire planet to be this closed loop system. And then he knew where he had to deal with things. And what would he find in these other places? Probably nothing, because there's nothing there. There's no people. There's no nothing. He understood his planet. It wasn't an electrified planet. You know what I mean?
Because he had the data there. It wasn't theoretical.
By the time Westmoreland was doing it, the world was starting to electrify. So there's terrorist groups going on in places that he doesn't know. And I'm not making any excuses. Vietnam was stupid. But I'm just getting to the overall. I can simply go back to the 80s and say I'm absolutely certain all these people were working with incomplete data sets that they didn't functionally understand, all the way up until 2008. And that's when the financial crisis happened, and that's also when Bitcoin pooped out. And ever since then, that decentralized blockchain structures have been getting bigger and stronger and bigger and stronger, because they have advantages that governments don't. If you wanted to secure that transoceanic fraud, and it looked an awful lot like an American president saying, don't worry about it. Our economic interests are buried in Kuwait as well. So Lloyd's of London can go ahead and insure a bunch of stuff there. And then we will ensure that the fundamental losses of someone stole all the oil fields and kept the equipment, we will insure against the total loss. We will show up, and there might not be any equipment left, but we'll have the oil fields and we'll have the land. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So in an insurance situation, you're literally starting to look at an army for strategically insuring certain pieces of. And it didn't have to go down like that. I'm not making any excuses. There's people yelling at the radio, but what about the Saudis? Just relax. None of it fundamentally matters until 2008. And then we get opportunity.
So is that when you started to develop
Right.
like your kind of, hey, I think I should start writing this down and kind of being more vocal about it?
In 2010, I became an intelligence analyst. 2008 through 2010, I had a lot of physical health problems. My neck was messed up, and I was being bounced around in the military without my family because I was medically messed up. So they were stationary and not being moved around. But those 2 years I was really just on me duty. So after 2010, I became an intelligence analyst. I went to Iraq. I saw how that whole thing went. And I was on literally the second to last plane. I was on the last full plane out of Iraq. Okay. So my understanding of the Iraq war was over. And then I came back and the whole thing started up again. I started looking into other things because I had a different mission. My next unit went to Kosovo. So Kosovo was, none of this is classified for anybody to worry about. So I started looking at the Kosovo mission, and there's drugs coming across the border. So now there's EU police, and there's Kosovo police, and there's Serbian police, and there's Serbian military, and then there's the American military, and then there's EU cops, and there's drugs going on. And basically, what was the military mission there? I didn't understand it. And so I started looking into it, and all of the economic policies surrounding the drugs and the actual problems that were going on there were all economic. So the military presence really didn't make sense because all we were providing was information support. We weren't there was a QRF, there was a big ass QRF of Bradley's, but it wouldn't have mattered. Like it wouldn't have mattered. There's no force to go send them out at. It's almost like we had to give you a combat unit just to give you the support elements that went with it. Bundling.
So how many is this happening all across the world, that there's intelligence analysts looking into what human action is looking like in every part of the world?
Well, listen, that's fundamentally an intelligence analyst job, and unless they know Misis's work, they would not ever necessarily use the phrase human action. But they do fundamentally understand human intelligence as one of the intelligences that an analyst will look at. So the more focused you are on human intelligence, the more you and I start getting into Mises, because it really does become economic. Like I said, in Ike's world, the whole place wasn't electrified. So the people, almost everyone on Earth, what were they doing? They were farmers. Oh, not in Ike's time. A long time ago, 90% of humanity were farmers. So by the time you get to Ike's time, it's not 90% of humanity, but there's still a lot of people. I mean, there aren't fundamentally continents of people just farming to stay alive. They don't have extra occupations and stuff. They might know other stuff, but Ike's world isn't electrified. What are the people in Brazil doing in the 50s? Brazil in the 50s was not like, Cuba in the 60s. And the only reason Cuba got that economic expansion is because the Americans brought some of that there, right? So a lot of things you see across the world, you get the impression that the world expanded as fast as America did. No way. We're running around here up in cars. There's, when Americans started driving around in the 50s, most of the world, bicycles, maybe. You know what I mean? We're closest to the economic prosperity of the last 100 years. So all of this prosperity kind of the innovations that poured out of America, they weren't in the far places of the world. Different world, and you just kind of have to understand these changes, that Americans in the 50s lived way different than the rest of Earth. And then all of us in the 80s lived way different than the rest of the Earth, even though the Earth was catching up to the 50s. And now the Earth is starting to get, you'll hear it like it's called a technology. It's fundamentally a technology jump. I forget what they call it, but it's where you skip technologies. People who they don't go landline internet. They go right to Wi-Fi. Like Africa is going to go right to Wi-Fi. They're not putting in the other infrastructure. They're all going straight to Wi-Fi and cell phone. So
yeah, I heard it's doing pretty well there.
Right. It's actually easier to throw them our old shit and give them a bunch of flip phones that they could use than it is to try and wire them. I mean, it really is. It's easier to take our secondhand stuff and give it to an entire continent than it is to wire it. So at a certain point, you look at, it's the enterprise environment factors that determine everything we're going to do and talk about, period. If we're talking about why, we're probably just a bunch of hopefuls who don't know how. If we're talking about how, all we have to agree on is the end state, and then we go towards it. So I had to learn Kosovo. Let me get through where I'm at. So we go through Kosovo. I learned about drug policy from Milton Friedman and David Friedman, and then I ended up into the whole Mises Institute of why is there a drug war anyway? So I'm really more just kind of ahead of everybody else than I am, onto something new. It's a lot of people solving the coordination problem. Lou Rockwell has an ability to tell everybody what he's thinking now. And they seem to associate this old man with racism. He's such a nice old man. It's weird. And, but, in the 80s, Lou Rockwell knew he didn't have the same opportunities he has now, right? He knew it. It was a whole different world. And you don't get to do those things in hindsight because there were rotary dial phones. in 1980. There might have been some digital phones in 1980, but it's just a fundamentally different environment that a lot of people will start judging instead of assessing. They will place a moralistic or ideological component into something instead of saying, what are the terms and conditions the people who were dealing with that enterprise were working under?